That does it. When this war is over, I'm going home. Colonel.
There's a moment in MASH that I genuinely cannot stop thinking about. It's not from one of the famous episodes. It's not the finale or the episode where Henry Blake dies, or any of the moments that show up in clip compilations about how emotionally devastating this show could be. It's quieter than all of that. It's a moment between scenes almost. Hawkeye Pierce walking from the OR to the swamp after a surgery that ran too long, and for about 3 seconds before he knows anyone is watching, his face does something that his face almost never does. It goes completely empty. Not sad, not tired. Empty, like a stage between performances, like the mask came down for just long enough to reveal that there was nothing holding it up from the inside. And then someone calls his name, and the grin comes back, and the line is ready, and Hawkeye Pierce is back in the room, fully present, fully performing, giving everyone exactly what they came for. And I've thought about those 3 seconds more than I've thought about almost anything else in the show, because those 3 seconds are the whole story. That's the truth the show spent 11 seasons dancing around without ever quite saying out loud. Hawkeye Pierce, the funniest man in the 4077th, the best surgeon in the unit, the emotional center around which everything else orbited, was secretly falling apart from almost the very beginning. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself. In the quiet, methodical, almost invisible way that the strongest people fall apart. Slowly. Behind the performance, in the 3 seconds when nobody is watching. This is that story. To understand how it happened, you have to understand what Hawkeye Pierce was carrying before career ever entered the picture.
What, are you kidding? When I was 7, Billy saved my life.
He did?
He grew up in Crabapple Cove, Maine, small town. His father, Daniel Pierce, was the local doctor, which meant that from the moment Hawkeye was old enough to understand anything, he understood this: the Pierce family shows up for people. That's not a value they discussed at dinner. It was the water they swam in. You give, you serve, you carry what needs carrying. You don't make it about yourself because it was never supposed to be about yourself. And then there's the thing the show mentions almost in passing and then carefully steps around for the rest of its run. Hawkeye's mother died when he was very young. Young enough that what he has isn't a memory. It's a shape, a specific, quiet, permanent absence in the place where a mother should be. And you can hear it in the way he never quite talks about her directly, not with grief, not with anger, just with this careful, deliberate sidestepping that looks like acceptance, but is really something closer to a wound that never fully closed. Because grief you can name is grief you have to feel. And Hawkeye Pierce, from a very early age, became extraordinarily skilled at feeling things just enough to keep functioning and then moving on before they could pull him under. So here is the child he was, a boy without a mother, raised by a father whose entire identity was built around selfless service. Growing up in a town small enough that there was no permission to fall apart, no space to be complicated, no room to be anything other than Daniel Pierce's capable, charming, together son. He learned to perform togetherness before he learned almost anything else. And then they sent him to Korea, and the performance had to get a lot bigger and a lot more convincing. And it had to run without a break, without an intermission, without a single night off, for 3 years. And nobody, not once, thought to check on the person doing the performing. Here's the thing that gets me when I watch the early seasons now, knowing how the story ends. The drinking is right there. From the very beginning, it's right there. Hawkeye and Trapper, and then Hawkeye and BJ distilling their own gin in a still they built in the swamp. Drinking constantly, drinking at levels that the show frames as a running gag, but that, if you step back and actually look at the quantity, at the consistency, at the way Hawkeye reaches for a drink, the moment any genuine emotional discomfort enters the room, it stops being funny almost immediately. It's not recreational drinking. It's not even social drinking, though it looks like both. It's pharmaceutical. It's a man self-medicating with the only thing available, using alcohol the way you'd use a painkiller, not to feel good, but to feel less. To turn the volume down just enough that the noise becomes survivable.
We couldn't help but notice that you came for the poker game and stayed for 2 weeks.
All right, just one.
And the show knows this on some level. There are moments across the run where it's acknowledged, where Sidney Friedman or Colonel Potter or even BJ looks at Hawkeye with something that isn't quite concern, but is adjacent to it. Where someone in the room notices the drink in his hand and the look on his face and understands for a moment that these two things are connected in a way that isn't entirely healthy. And then the moment passes, because Hawkeye makes a joke, because there are wounded coming in, because the format of the show requires him to be functional, and functional is what he gives them, and nobody pushes past the surface of it. Nobody ever really pushed past the surface of it. Before we go any deeper, I want to stop and ask you something because I think it's going to resonate. Think about the person in your life who always seems completely fine, who handles everything, who never complains, who is somehow always the one other people lean on when things get hard. And now think about whether you've ever actually looked closely enough to notice the 3-second gaps. The moments between the performance when the face goes somewhere else entirely. Drop it in the comments. I want to know, have you ever caught someone you loved in those 3 seconds and actually asked about it? Or did you let the next joke land and move on? Because I think most of us, if we're honest, let the joke land. And I think Hawkeye Pierce counted on that. He built his entire survival strategy around it. Let's talk about the humor, because the humor is where this gets genuinely complicated. It would be easy, was it, and wrong to say that Hawkeye used humor as a mask. That framing makes it sound deliberate, calculated, like he was consciously choosing to hide behind comedy. And I don't think it was like that. I think it was more organic and more desperate than that. I think laughter was the only emotional language Hawkeye Pierce fully trusted. Every other form of expression, direct vulnerability, asking for help, admitting fear, acknowledging that something had broken something in him, all of those required a kind of openness that his entire emotional history had trained him away from. His mother's death taught him that the people you open yourself to can disappear without warning.
When I was 7 years old, we were on a pond, and
His father's identity as the selfless community doctor taught him that need was something you managed privately rather than expressed publicly. His own brilliance taught him that competence was the currency of belonging, that as long as you were the most capable person in the room, your place in the room was secure. But humor was safe. Humor gave you intimacy without exposure. You could let people close enough to laugh with you without letting them close enough to see the thing you were actually protecting. You could fill a room with warmth and connection and genuine affection and still be, at your core, completely unreachable. That's what Hawkeye did for 11 seasons in plain sight, and we loved every second of it and called it charm. If this kind of layered character analysis is what you're here for, go ahead and subscribe before we keep going. This is genuinely all we do here, finding the hidden emotional architecture inside characters that millions of people watched without fully seeing. There's a lot more of this coming. I don't want you to miss it. Now let's talk about BJ, because BJ Honeycutt is essential to understanding what was happening to Hawkeye in the later seasons, and the dynamic between them is more complicated than the show lets on. When BJ arrives at the 4077th, he and Hawkeye form what becomes the deepest friendship in the show's run. And it's real. The warmth between them is completely genuine, completely earned, and Alan Alda and Mike Farrell play it with an easy intimacy that feels true in a way television friendships often don't quite manage. But here's what I noticed watching their dynamic closely across the seasons. BJ is emotionally whole in a way that Hawkeye is not. BJ has Peg, he has Erin, he has an entire life that exists outside this camp, a future that's real and specific and waiting for him at home in Mill Valley, California. And so even in the worst moments, even in the surgeries that run too long and the nights that don't end and the losses that accumulate past the point of processing, BJ has an anchor, something pulling him forward, a reason that exists beyond survival.
I mean, what's behind that?
Look, Father Mulcahy would like to say hello.
Hawkeye has no equivalent, and I think Hawkeye felt that difference. Not with resentment, he genuinely loved BJ, genuinely celebrated what BJ had, but with a quiet, private awareness of what he was missing. Watching BJ write letters to Peg, watching BJ talk about Erin with that particular light in his eyes, watching someone navigate the same impossible circumstances but with a tether to a future that made the circumstances bearable in a way they never quite were for Hawkeye. Because Hawkeye's future was empty, not in a dramatic, despairing way, just quietly, practically empty. There was no one waiting in Crabapple Cove, no relationship substantial enough to constitute a horizon, just his father, whom he loved, and a town that existed in memory more than in expectation. You can't move towards something that isn't there. And so Hawkeye stayed in the present, permanently, exhaustingly in the present, in the OR and the swamp, and the mess tent, and the endless noise of a place that never gave him anywhere to put his eyes when he needed to look somewhere that wasn't Korea. Let's talk about the sleepwalking. There's an episode, Season 5, Hawk's Nightmare, where Hawkeye begins sleepwalking. He's found outside in the dark, acting out scenes from his childhood, playing games, being a kid back in Crabapple Cove, completely unaware of where he actually is or what he's actually doing. The show treats it as a medical curiosity, a psychological puzzle to be gently solved. Sidney Friedman comes in. Some things are talked about. A resolution arrives. And then the show moves on, because the show always moves on.
I don't want to be paymaster.
That's more like it.
Oh, come on. I've already done that once this...
But I want to stay in that episode for a moment longer than the show did. His unconscious mind, the part of him that the performance can't reach, the part that operates when his defenses are finally down, is taking him home. Not to Korea, not to the OR home, to a version of himself that existed before any of this. A child in Maine playing a game, not responsible for anything or anyone, not the funniest man in the camp, or the best surgeon in the unit, or the emotional center that everyone unconsciously depended on. Just a kid. That's what his sleeping mind was reaching for. And think about what that tells you about the waking mind. If the unconscious is that desperate for relief, if sleep itself becomes an escape route back to a self that predates all the damage, then what was the waking experience actually like? Underneath the jokes and the gin and the surgical brilliance and the perfectly timed one-liners, what was it actually like to be Hawkeye Pierce on an ordinary Tuesday in Korea? The sleepwalking is the answer, written in the behavior of a man whose mind couldn't hold it anymore even while he was asleep. And the show gave it one episode, and then Hawkeye made a joke. And everyone moved on. I want to talk about the moments when the performance actually slipped. Not the big dramatic moments. The finale, Henry's death, the episode specifically designed to be emotional. Those are almost too obvious. The performance slipping in a designated emotional moment is still, in a way, a performance. The audience expects it. Hawkeye knows they expect it. I'm talking about the smaller moments, the ones the show didn't frame as significant. There's a recurring thing Hawkeye does that I've noticed across multiple seasons. When someone he cares about is in real danger, not abstract danger, not the general danger of being in a war zone, but specific, immediate, personal danger, his humor doesn't sharpen. It disappears completely. And what replaces it isn't another coping mechanism. It's just Hawkeye. Unguarded, unscripted, genuinely frightened in a way he can't talk his way around. Those moments are brief. The show doesn't linger on them. But they're there, scattered through the run like breadcrumbs. And if you follow them, they map something important. They map the outline of everything Hawkeye was protecting by keeping the performance running. Every person he couldn't bear to lose. Every connection that had gotten deep enough to constitute a real threat to his carefully managed emotional distance. Because here's the thing about emotional distance. It only works until it doesn't. You can build walls against intimacy all you want, but the people who get close enough anyway, the ones who sneak through the gaps, the ones your defenses recognize too late, those people take up residence in you whether you planned for it or not, and then their safety becomes your safety, and their danger becomes your terror. And Hawkeye, for all his self-protective architecture, was full of people he had accidentally let in. He just couldn't afford to say so, because saying so would mean admitting how much it would cost to lose them. And things that are real, in Hawkeye Pierce's experience, get taken away. Now let's talk about the anger, because Hawkeye's anger is one of the most psychologically revealing things about him, and it almost always gets misread. His anger doesn't look like most people's anger. He doesn't go cold, he doesn't shut down or pull back or go quiet. His anger looks like escalation, a joke that crosses a line, a confrontation that keeps going well past the point where the confrontation has accomplished what it needed to accomplish. A speech that turns into something raw and more exposed than a speech was ever supposed to be. Watch any of the episodes where Hawkeye takes on a military authority figure, a general making bad decisions, a visiting officer whose detachment from the reality at the 4077th is costing lives, and watch how Hawkeye handles it. He doesn't make his case and stop. He makes his case and then keeps going. He escalates past the argument into something personal and overwhelming, and the intensity of it is always the disproportionate to the specific situation. Because the specific situation isn't what he's angry about. He's angry about all of it. About Korea, about the blood on the table, about the faces he has started not being able to remember as clearly as he used to, about the gin that doesn't work as well as it did in the first year, about the specific loneliness of being surrounded by people who love you.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
May I join you, or is this table reserved only for...
And still feeling fundamentally unreachable, about the mother-shaped silence he's been carrying since childhood, and the father he can't stop trying to make proud from 10,000 miles away, and the future that keeps coming up empty every time he tries to picture it. All of that is in the room when Hawkeye confronts a general. The general is just where it has somewhere to go. He was always angry, he just had very few places where expressing it was acceptable. And so when those places appeared, he poured everything into them. Everything. Months of it. Years of it. And the people watching called it courage instead of crisis. And he let them. because courage was easier to carry than crisis. And maybe that's the loneliest part of all, being someone whose pain is so consistently misread as strength that eventually you stop trying to correct the record. You just wear the label they gave you. You become the brave one, the funny one, the one who always finds a way through because that's who they need you to be, and you stopped having the energy to argue with it somewhere around year 2. The war didn't just cost Hawkeye Pierce his peace of mind, it cost him the right to fall apart in front of people who loved him. And nobody ever even noticed what they'd taken. There's something almost cruel about that. Not intentionally cruel. Nobody in that camp wanted Hawkeye to suffer, but cruel in the way that systems are cruel, in the way that leaning on someone without ever checking the weight you're adding is cruel. Every time someone brought their pain to Hawkeye and he absorbed it and redirected it into a joke and sent them away feeling better, the transaction looked like generosity. And it was. But it was also a slow drain on something that was never being refilled. He gave, and the people he gave to were grateful and loving and completely unaware that gratitude and love, without attention, without someone actually looking at you and seeing the cost, eventually stops being enough to keep the lights on. And then there's Sidney Friedman. Sidney appears throughout the series as the unit's psychiatrist, and every time he does, he watches Hawkeye with a specific quality of attention that nobody else in the camp manages. Not concern exactly, more like recognition, like a structural engineer looking at a building and seeing the stress fractures that everyone else stopped noticing because they've been there so long they started to look like features. Sidney never pushes too hard, he knows better.
Something about a tidal wave and swimming in cold sweat.
He understands that Hawkeye's defenses are sophisticated enough that a direct approach just produces a better performance. So he circles, he creates space, he waits, and occasionally in those spaces Hawkeye says something unguarded, something real, something that wasn't prepared in advance and doesn't have a punchline attached. And then the space closes, and the performance comes back, and they both let it. But Sidney accumulates those moments, and I think by the time the finale arrives, he knows exactly what he's dealing with. He's known for a while. He's been watching the building develop cracks since the first time he walked into the 4077th and saw Hawkeye Pierce make a room laugh until it hurt. He knew. He was just waiting for Hawkeye to be ready to know it too. Goodbye, farewell, and amen. The last episode of MASH, one of the most watched broadcasts in television history. And Hawkeye is in a psychiatric facility, not visiting, not consulting, as a patient, having a breakdown that the show had been quietly, incrementally earning for 11 seasons without ever quite cashing the check. What Sidney is trying to reach across those sessions is a traumatic memory that Hawkeye's mind altered in order to survive it. The real version of the event was too much, so his brain did what brains sometimes do under extreme stress. It revised. It kept the outline and changed the detail that was unendurable. And the thing that gets me about that, the thing I genuinely can't stop thinking about, is that this wasn't a weakness. This was his mind doing the only compassionate thing it knew how to do, protecting him from something he wasn't equipped to carry in its true form. But protection has a cost. What the mind buries doesn't disappear. It just goes underground and grows heavier in the dark and waits with infinite patience for the moment the defenses finally get tired enough to let it through. And by the finale, the defenses were tired. 3 years of surgeries and gin and jokes and sleepwalking back to Maine, and anger aimed at generals and love that never quite landed the way it was supposed to, and loss that kept accumulating past the point where any person could process it cleanly. The defenses were exhausted, and so the memory came through. When it surfaces, when the real version finally breaks past the revised version and Hawkeye has to sit with what actually happened, Alan Alda doesn't play it big. There's no theatrical collapse. He just folds inward, quietly. The comedian disappears and the surgeon disappears, and what's left is someone so small and so stripped of everything that constructed him that he barely takes up space in the frame. And he cries. Not for the room, not as performance. The real kind. The kind that has been waiting behind 11 seasons of perfectly timed punchlines and never quite found its way out until now. Honestly, I've watched that scene more times than I can count, and it hits differently every time. Not because it's surprising. By that point in the series, nothing about Hawkeye breaking down should be surprising. It hits because of the recognition, the specific settling feeling of watching something finally be true out loud that you've known was true for a long time. Of course, this is where it ends. Of course, the person who held the whole camp together needed to be held together himself at the end of it. Of course, the jokes were always symptoms. Of course, the wall was always showing cracks that everyone chose not to look at directly. We chose not to look because we loved the performance, because the performance was extraordinary, because watching Hawkeye Pierce be brilliant and funny and heroic was one of the great pleasures of television, and the alternative, actually looking at the man behind all of it, actually asking what it was costing him, would have required us to reckon with something uncomfortable. That the people who give the most are often the people receiving the least, that the funniest person in the room is frequently the one in the most pain. That being indispensable and being seen are not the same thing. And Hawkeye Pierce, for all his centrality, for all the love that genuinely surrounded him in that camp, was seen far less often than he was needed. There's a detail in the finale that I want to end on. Not the famous detail, not the rock spelling Crabapple Cove, though that moment destroys me every time. Something smaller, something earlier in the episode when Hawkeye is in the facility and Sydney is sitting with him. There's a moment where Sydney just sits quietly, not asking anything, not pushing toward anything, just sitting, present, attentive, not needing Hawkeye to be funny or capable or useful or together, just sitting with him. And Hawkeye, for maybe the first time in the entire series, doesn't fill the silence with a joke. He just sits in it. And that moment, that small, quiet, unremarkable moment of one human being simply being present with another without requiring anything from them, is the most emotionally significant thing in the entire episode. Maybe in the entire series. Because it's the first time we see Hawkeye Pierce receive something. Not give, not perform, not manage or deflect or redirect, just receive. Someone sitting next to him in the quiet without needing him to be anything other than what he was. And what he was under everything, under the gin and the jokes and the surgical brilliance and the perfectly constructed defenses, was a man who had been secretly falling apart for years. Quietly, methodically, in 3-second gaps between performances that nobody thought to look at closely enough. He was falling apart the whole time. He just never stopped performing long enough for any of us to notice. And neither, if we're being honest, did we try very hard to look. Drop your video ideas in the comments. The best ones always come from you. See you in the next one.